Yeah.
All right, welcome back to the podcast, everybody. Thank you so much for supporting us on Patreon. Thank you for rating and reviewing this podcast. Our guest today is Gary Saul Morson, a professor of Russian literature at Northwestern University. And I read a very interesting interview with Professor Morson in the Wall Street Journal. It was titled "Violent Protest and the Intelligentsia," and I was delighted when I emailed him that we were able to connect. Professor Morson, welcome to the news.
I'm delighted to be here.
So, I've got a lot of people who talk about politics and draw conclusions. I'm excited to talk to somebody who knows about history and literature, and we can kind of draw our own conclusions, but I want to get your take on the past. So, like, one of the things that I'm seeing happening a lot lately are statues coming down here in America. And some of them make sense. They're Confederate generals. Some of them don't make sense. They're abolitionists. And then in some cases, I personally, find it a little troubling, say like a George Washington or a Thomas Jefferson. But my question for you, we'll start with, is just historically speaking. I mean, what are the parallels here? What have you seen where this has happened, where we try to basically remake history?
Well, what it suggests to me, and I don't know if it suggests questions to me. I don't know what the answer to these questions would be, but since there have been what look like analogous situations in the past, is this one of those analogous situations that applies to this situation? I don't know, but let me just tell you some of them, what they might be. Whenever you have a movement that thinks it has all the answers and all moral right on its side, there's a tendency for it to want to wipe out whatever is evil of the past. In the early days of the Russian Revolution, there was considerable sentiment for destroying all the old churches. That could be done on anti-religious grounds too. But also banning the great authors of Russian literature and old pre-revolutionary music. After all, they were all either bourgeois or aristocrats. Now, the regime decided not to do that after a few years, that instead they would reclaim that heritage and just give it a Marxist interpretation. But it was considered for a while. Something more extreme happened in China in the Cultural Revolution, where they really did destroy as much of the old artifacts that they could. And that is not the first time that happened in Chinese history. About 2,000 years ago, I'd have to look up the exact dates, there was a movement called the Legalists who took over and wanted to make sure that their rivals' philosophy would not be available to anyone to challenge them with. And so in this case, this may be part legend, they not only burned all the books, they burned or buried the scholars who knew the book, so they couldn't recreate them.
That's scary.
We saw something like that not so long ago with Taliban knocking down the Buddhist statuary because it was, of course, from another religion, which was therefore false, right? You didn't want something that dominant. So you try to start from as if history were beginning all over again. In the French Revolution, they decided to redo the calendar so that it would be year one of the Republic, right? So what we see here is not, unique. Now, whether that's what's going on here, I'd have to know much more about the motive of the people and what they really have in mind, or because what looks similar may not be similar, but it poses the question to me: what's the motive here? How far does it go? Is there a principle by which you're deciding to knock down some old statues but not others. If so, what has anyone articulated that principle? Or has it had nothing to do with, the idea of being morally pure, but just the fun of knocking down old things, which would make it quite different from the Taliban, where it's not a matter of fun, right?
And that would explain why you have abolitionists being, vandalized, right? Like there was even a John Brown statue in Kansas, I think, that was vandalized. And that would suggest to me that people are just tearing down statues. They don't even know exactly who they're tearing down.
I gather Ulysses S. Grant one was knocked down too.
Yeah.
And he's of course the one who defeated the Confederacy, which kind of suggests they're out having fun rather than, being like the Taliban. But I don't really know. I mean,
yeah. And there was somebody, sort of a prominent leftist, who tweeted, we got another one, and Grant owned a slave, which I think he actually did own a slave, which he freed or something he inherited. So at least somebody in that mob, I'll use the word mob, was aware of Grant. But some of the people involved maybe just just trying to be rebellious or something.
I don't know. I mean, the question would be, what's the principle and how far does it go? Or maybe there is no principle.
So I feel like, and this is me editorializing here, I feel like America in general has become less liberal, more illiberal on the right and the left. And one of the things that I see is almost like a relativistic society that's like, it's not, hey man, it's my truth. There is no actual truth. And it seems like I've seen people on the left and the right who are engaging in like sort of Orwellian speak of late. It seems to be more of a pattern in the recent years. You mentioned earlier something that reminded me, there's a line I've heard you in interviews before, and even in this Wall Street Journal piece, say that there was something in the Soviet Union where you had free speech as long as you didn't lie. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, this was actually an anecdote that happened to me when I first visited the Soviet Union, more than 50 years ago. And I was speaking to a Soviet citizen and about the differences between the two countries. And she said, well, of course we have complete free speech. We just don't allow anyone to lie. Which obviously, and it struck me, because who determines what's a lie? Well, the government determines what's a lie. So you have free speech unless you say something the government doesn't want you to say, in which case they call it a lie. I used to get laughs by telling that story, and now I sometimes get puzzlement. Well, what's wrong with that? It used to be obvious to people,
Well, I'm seeing something now, like in the New York Times, where young journalists are saying, we need to dispense with this fiction that we can be fair and balanced, because actually there's a right side and there's a wrong side. You could be on the wrong side of history, and it's always been a fiction anyway, that we were unbiased. So we should just be on the side of what's moral and what's right. To which I say, I welcome you to my pro-life cause, but I don't think they're gonna sign up for that. That is a problem, right? When you start to believe that you have, anybody who believes they have all the answers, that's a little bit of a dangerous thing, I think.
Well, the question is, a democracy depends on the notion that you don't have all the answers. That's why you have free speech. That's why you have more than one political party. If somebody had all the answers, there'd be no reason to have compromise, to have give and take, to have two political parties, to have parties alternate power, because one side would have all the answers and the other side would simply be wrong. When you believe that, then you clearly, the next step is to eliminate the possibility that the evil people or the unscientific people, if you want to look at it that way, will ever gain power. And that is precisely the argument the Soviets used. They have scientific socialism, which is on the right side of history. And anyone who disagrees with the party is necessarily, at best, unscientific, and at worst, evil, and has to be done away with. That's a fairly logical, almost inevitable conclusion from the notion that all truth and all morality is in your hands. You can't be wrong. Now, if you thought that my opinions are better than yours, but they're just opinions. Well, opinions, can turn out to be wrong. You've made predictions that turned out to be wrong. You've instituted policies which were well-intentioned that didn't work out the way you thought they would. So maybe it's time to tinker with them. Those are notions you don't get if you think you have all the answers.
Yeah.
Right?
No, I read a book a while back. I read a book a while back about how Churchill wanted to get rid of the Spitfire. I'm a huge Churchill fan, but according to this book, he wanted to get rid of the Spitfire plane that actually won, the Battle of Britain, because everybody thought that the future were like bigger planes that could bomb people or something instead of like these little planes. But Churchill couldn't get rid of them because of like the bureaucracy in English, the way that it worked. You just couldn't unilaterally snap your finger. And there was some benefactor who was actually paying to produce them, as I recall. And so the bottom line is the Britain was saved by virtue of the fact that they weren't able to turn on a dime and implement this top-down order. And so I feel like free societies benefit from the fact that they mitigate the potential for any sort of belief that you actually have the answer.
Yeah, I mean, the key, even if you don't have, much political freedom, there's a separate issue that is important, and that is a division of power. And you can have that with more or less political freedom, because you divide power. This is how it originally worked in Britain, how Montesquieu talked about it, and different groups have power so that no one can precisely impose their will on everyone. They have to talk to other interest groups and compromise. And if you thought that one group had all the answers permanently, you wouldn't do that. The notion of dividing power depends on the notion of human fallibility, that nobody has all the answers. And that clearly was written into our Constitution. That's why, 3 branches. Why have 3 branches? Just have a president or king who can do anything. And you have, 2 branches of the legislature, and then power divided also between the federal and state levels, and, staggered elections for the House of Representatives and the Senate. I mean, you do all these things in order so that, you're creating constant need for people to talk to each other and negotiate. That is, on the notion that they're guided by opinions, not truth. They may think they're, guided by truth. Passions, as the founding father would say, could, dominate for a while, but you want to prevent that from being permanent by delaying things, so that passions usually don't last very long. So if you make it 6 years between senatorial elections, and only 1/3 each 2 years, you might, give, court justices lifetime appointments. Well, maybe that will slow things down. And that whole notion depends on something that, Lenin and the Soviets explicitly rejected, namely that there was legitimate difference of opinion.
There's this part in this Wall Street Journal piece where you talk about in late Tsarist Russia, the Liberal Party did not condone terrorism, but they refused to condemn it. And it does strike me that we are now, me editorializing here, entering into a period where it seems like, the illiberal left and the illiberal right kind of believe the ends justify the means, kind of believe they have to take matters into their own hands. And then I think you have people, I'll go back to the statue analogy, where there's a certain number of people who are thought to be mainstream who are like, I wouldn't personally tear down a statue, but I'm cool with the fact that they're doing it, or but talk about this thing in Russia, how this developed.
I hadn't thought about the American analogy there with the statues. I was thinking of the party known as the Constitutional Democrats, or Cadets, who were the Liberal Party. They were not a terrorist party the way the anarchists and socialists were. Terrorism was very common at the time. Thousands of people were being killed.
Yeah. I should make the point that tearing down a statue may be vandalism, and it may be vigilanteism, but it's not terrorism.
This is just a loose analogy, and that's one of the reasons why it may not apply. But what's important is the argument that the leading liberals give not to condemn terrorism at all. Now, they supposedly believed in a constitutional democracy, and they knew perfectly well that terrorism is incompatible with that, and that the purpose of terrorism was to destroy any possibility of that. So you'd think they would have taken a stand against it. But, as one of the leaders said, object to terrorism, that would be the moral ruin of the party. That's a direct quote. You must never, ever take a stand against someone to the left of you. It's just not done.
Was it like no enemies to my left? That the...
Right. We are different factions of the same wonderful moral oppositionist groups. You Bolsheviks are a little bit of a hurry, but basically we're the same. Of course, they were not at all the same. And when the Bolsheviks took over, they shot all these people, right? They shot the other socialists too, not just the liberals, right? They shot the other Marxists, the Mensheviks. But that notion disabled any possible resistance. So that even when the Bolsheviks took over,
so my analogy, and again, this is
what the liberals supposed to do, that they were not used to ever fighting, even though they saw this was dangerous. They were disabled morally from resisting.
All right. So my analogy, and again, this is me talking, not you. Maybe the better analogy is if you are a Reagan conservative and you hate the media and you hate the left and you just go along with whatever Trump and the illiberal right say, because I can't criticize my team because, the bad media is out there. You basically have a scenario where people, they just decide I'm on this tribe or I'm on this tribe, and I will not criticize anybody, even though we dramatically differ on, so many things. I won't dare criticize my quote unquote team.
Yeah. Now, how much will you not criticize? How far will it go? Is it that I'm not going to criticize them now before this election on this particular issue because that issue is not so important compared to the ones I do agree with? Or is it no matter what my people do, they are my people and we're going to destroy the others, and no matter what they do, I'm with them? Those are rather two different formulations, and you can slide from the more gentle one into the more extreme one without even being aware you're doing it. I think of the process by which people go from a relatively moderate critique to one of those extreme ones. I think of it as a slide. And it's a slide because it accelerates as you go down, as you proceed on it. And it will happen if there is no conscious limit that you have in mind. Yes, I will go with them, but only so far. If they do this, I won't. And the same thing could be said on a group, on a national scale. If there is no one who would stand up and resist, because if there's no one who would resist going further and further, this is what we saw from the French Revolution, right? The people who made the revolution found themselves guillotined by people further to the left, who found themselves guillotined people further. Unless there's a principle or a group that will stand up and say, we will not allow this, it will continue to slide faster and faster to the extreme position. So the question you have to ask in each situation is there a group that has in mind a point they won't go beyond, and has the moral fortitude to actually stand up at some cost to themselves? If there isn't such a group, then you can almost guarantee that it will continue to accelerate to a more and more extreme position. At least that's what happened with the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution.
Yeah. I wonder if there's something special about America. It's dangerous to rely on that, but I wonder if there's something special about America that we are not as susceptible to that, or if that's a foolish, naive thing to suppose.
I'm not an American expert, so I don't know. It's a good question to ask.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't want to rely on that, because
Right.
If you're wrong, it's all over.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your head's on the block. I'd like there to be. I'd like to see people behaving not like those Russian constitutional Democrats, and not like that
Yeah.
Reagan supporter you imagined, but who will say, we're not going to go. We're going to stand up and prevent it from going that far, right? And we're not afraid to do it. At some risk to ourselves, we will stand up. That's what you would want to see. Otherwise, each side is in danger of pushing the other to accelerate more and more, right?
Yeah.
And,
I heard you talking.
I don't know if there is such a group. I mean, because again, I live with in Russian history, so.
I heard you talking about Lenin a while back, and you were making this point that in America we we sort of believe in original sin, and so we're trying to take little kids and train them to have a conscience and to think of other people, not just themselves. And that in Russia with Lenin, they did the opposite. It was actually trying to get rid of the conscience and empathy and sympathy for other people, and a sense of right and wrong, and replace it just with class consciousness. And it occurs to me that, as I've fought the illiberal right, that there is an ethos or a sense that people like me who are never Trumpers, or people who are like Christians who take their faith very seriously, are actually weak, because we just don't get it, because this is actually a struggle that is about power. Politics is about who does what to whom, and it's not about ideas. It's about who has the power. And so people like me are just not, we're weak. And that's a problem. Having weaklings on your team is a bad thing. And this parallels, I think, with some of the things that were happening under Lenin.
Well, you said a lot there. Well, let me start with before we get to the weakling part, let me start with the ethic part. Yes, I mean, the model that most Americans have is that, people are born selfish and asocial, and you have to socialize, children in order not to be selfish, teach them, to respect others, people's property, not to, to respect others, to share, as the little kids are told to do. and then teach them eventually to have, well, what do you think she's feeling, kind of thing,
Right.
right? Well, that the Soviets and Lenin didn't work with that notion. They worked with the notion that people have naturally in them, and this is say what Adam Smith would have said, for instance, that people are naturally compassionate and concerned with other people. It's built into them as much as selfishness is. And you have to get rid of that. The word, you mentioned conscience. People who lived through the revolution, were educated before but lived after, noted over and over again that the word conscience disappeared after the revolution. It was a bad word. So was, compassion and pity. All these words were bad words because if you were a true Leninist, the world was divided into the good people on the side of the party and the proletariat and the bad people. And the moral thing to do was to kill the people on the wrong side. And compassion would prevent you from doing that. Compassion was an old liberal bourgeois value, or it perhaps was a Christian value, which was even worse as far as the Bolsheviks were
Right.
concerned. Right? Actually, it's hard to say which they thought was worse. But the idea, that Christian ethic, anything derived from God was automatically on the wrong side. That has to be wiped out. So they developed, children were actually taught that compassion and pity were bad things and had to be overcome. So at the crucial moment, it would not stay their hands from killing a class enemy or doing someone in the way the party ordered. So it was a completely different sense of ethics there. And, the great writers, Solzhenitsyn, Vasily Grossman, they all wrote about this. And, they pointed out that, although the Bolsheviks decided not to eliminate the tradition of Russian literature, rather to give it a Marxist interpretation, the values of compassion, and caring for others and that kind of morality is written right into Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Chekhov. And in fact, they were educating their people two ways at the same time. They didn't think they were, but they were. And there were people who theorized that in fact, if they wanted to keep their society, they should have banned Russian literature. But it has so much prestige in Russia, they couldn't do it.
Do you think they should have? I mean, do you think they would have been better off by doing that?
I think they might have held on to power better, yeah, because they was trying to get rid of all humanistic values, and there it was, right? All you have to do is give whatever Marx interpretation you want of war and peace. It's not. Compassion is a value it teaches, and not by overt preaching, but by the way the characters relate to each other, by playing in your own sympathy for the characters. The other thing you mentioned was people who are not willing to go along with anything, weaklings. I would rather think that people who are willing to go along with anything they don't believe, weaklings. They know it's wrong, but they won't do anything about it because they're intimidated by their side's mob. Those are the weaklings, the people willing to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do it. I guess they could be with them. Mostly, I think of those people as people of strength. It seems the exact opposite is the case with me.
Yeah,
you have to be on your own or with a small group opposed to the dominant trend. That's not easy.
I think you're totally right. Some people, sort of elites are, surprised that someone like Donald Trump resonates so well with a lot of kind of working class Americans. And it seems to be an interesting phenomenon where oftentimes you would see, like in the case of a revolution, like the poorest people were pretty loyal to the king, but it would be maybe like middle class people who were the revolutionary class. And we see it in Russian history you know, and by the way, this is in 1984, in a slightly different way, where Winston Smith talks about the proles being the only, you know, the only hope. Um, but that's a little bit of a different, I guess, interpretation on it. But we saw this in Russian history where, you know, the communists were like ostensibly cared about the common man and the work and kind of the poor, but they really didn't trust them or see them as their allies, did they?
No. Yes, the only ones who really counted as proletariat, it wasn't the poor, it was being of the right social class, which would involve you being poor, but you could be poor and not be of the right social class. So you can be, you know, for example, they, like Marx, they didn't have much respect for peasants. Workers ranked far above peasants in their ideology. But if a worker, you know, believed in something like trade unions, that showed that he wasn't a real worker. He was affected by, you know, bourgeois ideology. And so he wasn't a genuine worker. Who is a genuine worker? The person we decide is a genuine worker, which was a very small group of them. That is, the only genuine one is the one who endorses our program. Okay? It could be a very small percentage, and it typically was. And that's another way you can tell when, you know, a group that claims to represent some other group really does. Does it judge, does it have the habit of saying, well, you're not a real X because you don't think like us. You're not one of them. You may externally be like one of them. You may actually work in a steel mill like a good worker, but if you don't think, you're not a real worker, or whatever other the criterion is. That's one of the ways you tell whether they represent who they say they represent.
You know, and I alluded to this a minute ago, but just the notion that politics is all about power and it's about who does what to whom, as opposed to the notion that it could be, you know, self-actualization or advancing freedom or a political ideology or philosophy or the distribution of you know, limited goods or whatever. What is, talk about, if you would, like this idea that it's just about power, and if you think that that's reality, or is that actually like a very dangerous idea to have?
Well, think of the usual use of the word politics in, you know, Western countries. To say that a question is political, you mean, well, you know, there'll be this interest group and that interest group, and they'll trade off and they'll compromise, and, you know, sentences like, you should never watch sausages in legislation being made, because there's no consistent principle there. It's trading off. That's what politics is in a democracy. It's people of different views and different interests coming together to create something that...
The art of the possible, right? Which involves compromise and give and take.
And why do they do it? Well, think of it this way. In, you know, one of the first things you're taught in basic economics is that every time there's an uncoerced transaction, an act of buying and selling, both sides are better off. Because if the buyer didn't think he was better off with the good than the money, she wouldn't buy. And if the seller didn't think she was better off with the money than the goods, she wouldn't sell. Both are better. It's not zero sum, right? But in the other sense of politics, the Leninist sense of politics, it's always zero sum. Anything that you have is a loss to me, right? So that what followed from that was, you don't compromise. You only compromise if that's better than losing. If you have the advantage over your opponent and don't press it, if you can kill your opponent and you don't, then you are, you know, a bourgeois Christian liberal. It means you don't.
You're a sucker. You're a dope.
Yeah,
You're a fool.
When one of Lenin's top people made such a suggestion. They were negotiating something with the Americans, and he suggested making, a concession. They didn't absolutely have to. Lenin literally called the rest of the Politburo and said this guy should be examined psychiatrically and put into an insane asylum.
Wow.
Okay? I mean, you simply, if you can kill somebody else and you don't, then there's something wrong with you.
Right. And I think it's forbearance is it's the fruit of, the fruits of the spirit is one of them, I think, is forbearance, which is doing that. It's not running up the score on your opponent just because you can.
Well, I think the other view is I'm old enough to remember, Lyndon Johnson before he was president, when he was the Senate Majority Leader, and his favorite quotation from the Bible was, "Come, let us reason together." That's what politics is like in either a democratic society or a pluralistic society. Even if it's not democratic, there are mutual interest groups that no one can dominate the others. That's what it will be like.
Right. Well, that's what I would like to say right now is let's have a limiting principle. I think we should I'm fine with getting rid of these Confederate generals. We could put them in a museum. They probably shouldn't be in a public park or something, but let's make a distinction between people who were famous because of their sins or people whose contributions, were made in spite of their sins. That would be a great...
What? In spite of their...
In spite of their sins.
I see.
So like Thomas Jefferson, he had a great contribution in spite of his failings, in spite of his sins. I make a big distinction between that and people who are famous because, of their sins, or primarily because of a vice. But I don't think it's in...
Isn't famous because he held slaves. That's not why people put up statues to him, right?
Exactly.
Whereas, let's say Robert E. Lee was famous for leading the Confederacy and break up the Union and preserve slavery. So those would be two different. That's the distinction there.
I think so, and I think that's a kind of just one example of a compromise. We could stop it there, and I think we could have a consensus in America where people come together and agree. But I don't think it's in the best interest of either the left or the right to have that compromise. And I would say probably people on the left believe that the wind is at their back. Why should they stop pushing?
Right.
And maybe some of them do want to topple all sorts of establishment, historical pieces of the establishment that they do deem to be repressive. And then I think there are people on the right who they benefit from having this culture war flaring, right? That's how they rile up their voters to turn out on election day. It's a horrible situation.
Yeah, it's also very short-sighted, to do it that way, because if you created a situation of when our guys get into power, you guys are destroyed, you can't guarantee that your guys want to get into power, or if they are, that the same dynamic will not work within your group. Your group gets into power, and then it's split. I don't know, the liberals get power, and then, AOC has Schumer executed. It splits again, and it splits again. And that which has happened in the French and Russian revolutions, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't stop. It's not like we win once and for all. The
Did you
dynamic of your opponent continues.
Did you see The Death of Stalin?
The movie, yeah.
The movie, yeah.
Yeah. It's actually, as far as the documents go, reasonably accurate. It's quite...
it's gallows humor, to be sure, but I mean the part where they couldn't find the best doctors to save Stalin because he had them executed, is ironic.
Right. And the ones, the last thing in his there's this wonderful book, by the way, I just reread, called Stalin's Last Crime, about the doctors plot. And all these doctors were accused of being part of an international Zionist conspiracy directed from America to destroy the Soviet leadership by mistreating them medically. In a whole sense, doctors were, were executed, and it was to lead to a mass pogrom, and against all the Jews in the Soviet Union. Probably half of them would have been killed. But as in the Great Terror wasn't going to stop there, the secret police was also targeted, and their people were being arrested. And then you go to the army. It's just exactly like 1937, and it would have happened except Stalin suddenly died, as in that film. And as I say, they weren't. It's not just that they'd executed the best doctors. The ones who remained were terrified. Right.
Yeah.
We're poisoners. You're going to accuse us. We're supposed to go. I have something. No. I'm not going to do it. Right. I mean, it's very hard to get them in a situation like that. Right. If people cannot perform their profession without, being afraid of being, punished for it, can't exercise their best judgment, then you're not going to have them to.
It's a scary world. So I just hope that our conversation today is purely hypothetical and based on an interest in Russian history and literature, and not in any way. I hope it is not in any way predictive of where we are heading here.
Yeah, I hope so. I don't know. I mean, if I knew, if I knew we were headed in that direction, I'd immediately cash in my whole retirement. Right?
Well, the problem is
I haven't done that. I haven't done that, which means the
problem with America being the last best hope is there's nowhere to go. I mean, maybe Canada. I don't. There's no plan B. So we got to fix this country and keep it on the straight and narrow.
Well, think of it this way: Canadians just love to define themselves as whatever the Americans aren't. So maybe if we go wrong, they'll go right.
Maybe.
Who knows, right? If it goes wrong, then Putin's Russia will have more freedom than we do if it goes wrong.
Scary stuff. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been a insightful and interesting discussion.
I enjoyed it.
Thank you very, very much for doing it. Gary Saul Morson, thank you for coming on the news.
Thank you for having me. It's been fun.
All right. That was great.